Ben. How are you?
Hey Sandra, I'm good. How about yourself?
Good, good. Yeah, we're live on LinkedIn and YouTube on my show, Engineer Her Path. And this is my colleague, Ben Jerauld. We're on a remote team, so we actually have never physically met and live in different states. But this is fun to actually have a real colleague, a real coworker on my show for the very first time. You're the very first one that's ever accepted. And yeah, to introduce him a little bit, he's a software developer on our agile software team. Super deep, insightful, wise beyond your years, such a deep thinker. So I thought this would be a really good conversation and also a chance for people to hear from someone that's been doing software development for over 10 years.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm glad we're finally kind of getting some time. We're in different states, but we're both very cold right now. So we get to share, have that in common. But yeah, so I've been a software developer for 10 years. Started, pretty much got into software development. In high school, I took like a random computer science class. It was one of those goofy ones where it's like you're drag and dropping like little widgets to like build like almost like a little movie scene with like Nintendo graphics. So I just took that as like a random like class. It was like, oh, you can video games with this. That's cool. And then from there, ended up taking computer science as my major in college. And then from there, I was pretty much hired directly into kind of the consulting groups up in like the DC, Northern Virginia area. A lot of the school that I went to, a lot of people kind of their jobs filter into this area. And then I've been working in consulting for computer programming for the past almost 12 years. And yeah, primarily front end dev. I've kind of shifted more like kind of a little bit of full stack as well as a little bit of cloud work as well. So kind of getting a broad spectrum of stuff there. Yeah, so it's been quite a lot of experience dipping my toes in quite a lot of fields across consulting.
Yeah. So did you pick consulting or was it just like that those were the jobs when you were graduating and they found you?
Yeah, it's really kind of the jobs when I was graduating. I went to JMU, James Madison University, shout out, great school. And they actually had like a on-campus hiring program. So I didn't have to like go to DC, like companies would come to campus and have interview kind of processes there. So that was really helpful. But, a lot of them are just like, hey, we're trying to, build out our consulting programs. At the time, computer science was a little underserved, so it was a little bit more competitive for the companies to get computer science graduates than maybe kind of the current job market for computer science at like an entry level.
Yeah, yeah. Have you always worked in, I mean, well, just so people know, I mean, we work in the defense industry. Have you always worked in the defense industry?
Not always. When I first started, it was on like the healthcare side of things, so like HHS, Healthcare Human Services. And then I've done a little bit of just kind of work across the board, some private corporate consulting, some more like general stuff for the federal government, and then a little bit of like stateside contracting, but nothing too in depth there. I've primarily been kind of on the like DoD side of things for the past, I'd say, like 8 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost 75%. That's,
Yeah,
that's pretty much almost all of it. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And how long have you been working from home?
yeah. So that's been an interesting one. When I first started working, it was always kind of like a hybrid environment. So we'd have like 1 or 2 days a week that we could work from home because we don't have laptops. We didn't have like huge desktops that we needed to like lug around or anything like that. And then COVID hit, and that was kind of the start of the full shift into fully remote work for me. And that was interesting because, my job location was just a little bit down the street from where I lived, which has kind of shifted now going into the more modern world of fully remote. The company I work for has kind of embraced that where, oh, we can actually source a lot of really good talent from across the country and utilize them for roles where some of the larger industry they have that challenge of like, oh, we have all this commercial space, we have all these buildings that are sitting empty. But with remote work, going into COVID, started for me fully then, and I just never had kind of the requirement to go back into the office. But I still kind of maintain this mindset of, I'm working remote, but I still need to maintain myself kind of as a Northern Virginia, like, accessible consultant. But with regards to that, I did, like, me and my wife, we bought a house and moved south about 40 miles from where we were living, which is funny because on my current project now, I'm even closer than before. So, like, don't even have to get on 95 if I wanted to go there, which, for those of you who know about Northern Virginia, it is quite nice.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. You've been working from home for a long time.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about how now they have this return to office executive order thing. And not that it directly affects us, but I'm just wondering, like, maybe the impacts of that later on,
Yeah, definitely just that calculus of commuting adds a lot of, like, I guess, mental time back into my day because, I'm not having to spend all this time commuting back and forth, which is really nice. But, remote work has some challenges as well. Like, all my stuff is just in my home, like, home office. So it's really hard to kind of feel disconnected from work at times. And then sometimes you just don't get that, like, kind of decompression period when you go from, like, work to, for us, we have a 6-month-old. So it's like, all right, I submitted all my tickets for the day and look, here you go. Like, guess who's upset right now? So there's some challenges there. And then just being on a remote team and being on in-person teams, you kind of lose that sense of camaraderie at times, or, like, being able to go out with your, like, teammates and just have a lunch and kind of, trash talk the code, or, make
we've
fun
been
of
teammates
stuff.
for over a year. We still have not met. We're supposed to meet in April. We'll see, but it's interesting. It's a different dynamic. You're right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what other type of fun projects, or, like, what's maybe some of your notable type of work that you're very fond of?
Yeah. So let's see. Right now, I'm kind of goofing around with a front end application I've been working on in Angular for just like a side project, and it's for a board game I play called BattleTech. And the idea of the application is just to, essentially create, like, a random group of bad guys to play against. But what I'm using for that is just an opportunity to brush up on some Angular skills, some front end skills, kind of just start cobbling together a boilerplate. What I kind of like about it is just the opportunity to design something in kind of a green field. I'm the product owner. I'm making the requirements. I'm saying what I don't and don't want, which is um, nice to a degree, but it also kind of gives that opportunity to have a design space and work in. So it'd be like, okay, like, there's, for front end people, like, oh, I'm using just plain CSS for Angular. And then I'll be like, okay, let me throw in Tailwinds, which is library for that, which speeds up that. And I was like, okay, let me throw a SAS processor and see how that goes. And, in a work environment, you might not have, you might get yelled at if you're just like, hey, I ripped out a chunk of the system and replaced it with something else. But for me, it's just like, I guess when I'm programming, part of the thing I like about it is just the opportunity to design something almost like from an architecture point of view. And so I get a lot of satisfaction of just kind of building that application end to end, kind of full stack. I don't have a middle stack or a database, but it's still looking pretty good so far. But so that's the main kind of thing I've been doing as well. And then eventually I'll paint some of my Battletech miniatures too. So yeah, it's one of those things. It's kind of like that continuing education aspect of being a programmer that I kind of like to think about of, where are kind of my gaps in what I'm doing while I'm working, and what would I like to expand on? And then, trying to take some of my side hobbies, say like, hey, what could I do here with my actual skill set, get the chance to learn some new stuff, and then kind of combining it with something that I'm a bit more passionate about. So then I feel more motivated to kind of work with it as
That's
a
good.
major.
You brought up a good point because it's interesting that some people, like we were talking about before, abandon a lot of their hobbies and interests for the pursuit of work. But you're right, at work, you're kind of told what to do. But then this, where you can be a little more creative and you get to design it and it's the way you want to do it. But you're also learning at the same time, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely like a challenge with being a programmer and a developer is, a lot of times you're kind of expected to be this like 5-star guru, like you're doing like lead code projects, like when you're not working and you're almost like expected to be this like coding automaton who's just jamming out code 24/7. And I
Yeah.
don't even really jam out that much code when I was doing this side project. Like, a
Do you
lot
think
of
that's more to show off or they're genuinely like really into it or they want to brag about it?
I think it varies a lot based on kind of the professionals. Like there are some people who just really like, coding and doing that type of thing, and that's awesome. But I think because they have like, those like 5-star developers who are really into that, there's a lot of like industry pressure. And I remember when I was getting interviewed like, 8 years ago, and it'd be like, oh, what are your side projects you're doing? And how many like open source repositories are you committing
Oh,
to? And like this expectation that I just like leave my day job and then do another day job
yeah.
for proving that I'm a good enough developer, which I think can be kind of a toxic mindset, because we're people.
You're multifaceted. You're so right because I never thought of this. Any other type of engineer, they wouldn't be like, "What are you civil engineering?" In your spare time. What circuits are you building, or are you building, a computer? It's like you don't have to prove that you're just the greatest engineer because that's all you think about, and you do all this stuff outside of work. And it's funny because I think developers, yeah, you're right. They're always expecting that you have all these side projects and you're coding things and developing stuff on the side.
It's definitely a balancing act because, you're not always, on the cutting, bleeding edge of technology. And one thing with, programming is a lot of stuff, it's constantly evolving, constantly changing. So there's somewhat of a need to stay on top of kind of how things are going in the industry,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can kind of keep up your skills and make sure that you're kind of evolving with it. Because I do think that kind of ability to kind of adapt to the like changing environments like is important as a developer for professional
Yeah.
development and growth in that aspect, but it shouldn't be at the cost of like your personal life. Like you shouldn't spend all day sitting at your desk. Like everyone go walk and maybe do some exercise.
Yeah.
Our health is
How do
important.
you find you learn these other skills? Is it just by doing? Is it you're watching videos, or how do you do this
Yeah.
stuff?
It depends. I think the way I learn the best is just getting to actually play with like a demo of something, kind of
Mm-hmm.
tinker around, see what works. So like I always like a just simple Git repo I can pull and run, or like a stack blitz just to show off like a component library, that type of thing. Occasionally I'll look up like a YouTube video, especially if it's like something more of like course related, like a CompTIA certification, or maybe getting into like the nitty gritty of like Angular. If there's like, I'm like, okay, how does a directive like work like in this situation? Those like somewhat more technical things, I'll either look up a YouTube video or pull up like the documentation on it. Sometimes the documentation can be quite spotty, but yeah. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of go about that.
Okay. Yeah, definitely people can be self-taught, but yeah, I think there's something about getting into something and doing it more than just
Hmm.
this passive like video watching, right?
Yeah, and I think some of that can also be influenced by kind of like how I started my computer science education, since I have that formal computer science background. Like I do have kind of that base level understanding of a lot of like the core concepts. So, I'm not getting like lost to like in the documentation, reading some of the core concepts because it's like, oh yeah, I know how this data like structure works. I don't need to worry about that, or I know what this programming pattern is. So having those core fundamentals is really important. Um, But also I think two things that were pretty, I guess, foundational, or at least one thing I can think of off the top of my head was I worked as a teaching assistant in college. And I think a really important soft skill to have as a developer is being able to read other people's code, especially
Oh,
bad code written by college entry level or like college like first three class computer science students, because you have
yeah.
to be able to kind of read and parse through and figure out kind of how stuff is working in the moment. That's like a good soft skill to have as a developer. That's probably more beneficial to you like in your day to day than jamming out a bunch of like lead code, like
Oh, interesting.
like whatever programming trick that you just learned is.
Is it so you can read it and understand it, and then you can kind of not regurgitate, but you can learn something from it instead of just maybe just cutting and pasting and not really understanding it?
Yeah, I'd say that there's that bit of like just being able to more readily understand code just like by reading it over,
Hmm.
maybe being able to quickly identify flaws in the code. Um, the amount of times I had to correct somebody missing a semicolon that was causing the whole program to break was quite a lot. Um, Obviously, we have IDEs for that now, so that makes things easier.
I knew you kind of had a teacher vibe. It seemed like you could explain things very well. I know you mentioned before that you sat in on some hiring of other devs. And what do you think, is important to look for when, a team is hiring someone?
Yeah, so I've kind of gotten into it a bit. Like when I'm evaluating like somebody's like development skills, I kind of do look for like that core foundational experience, but I try not to pose technical questions. Like everybody knows about like the Google technical interview.
Yeah.
And a lot of those can be like, oh, do you know FizzBuzz? Yes, no. And if you don't, like, oh, you're a trash dev, like, disregard this like person's interview. And I don't think that's necessarily a fair, like, if you're Google and you're interviewing like thousands of devs, I guess you have to have some heuristic.
Trying to stump the person and
Yeah.
just like wash them out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but those types of gotcha technical questions, I don't particularly think are beneficial for developers, and I think it's more poorly reflective of the people asking the questions. Like sometimes it's like
Mm.
dev leads who are trying to prove that they're smart to people interviewing, and I think you do want to ask like a few questions on languages they've worked on. I like to ask like what is one thing that you're like opinionated on with regards to like a language you work on.
That's good.
It's because then that's an open-ended question, and then that lets them show that they have experience working in something, show that they know the ins and outs but of their choosing, like. So I think that's helpful. And then you start evaluating things on a lot of the soft skills that aren't necessarily present on resumes, but are important as a developer. Developers aren't working alone; they're working in teams. So
Very
it's like
true.
you care about how grumpy the person is. You care about how helpful their answers are. You care about how they communicate and how they present themselves. So it's just, again, developers are people. So the soft skills pay a lot of dividends in kind of creating a cohesive team and helping ensure.
Oh, interesting. Like what percentage you think soft skills versus hard skills? I never thought it was always that important as a dev because you can work a little more independently compared to
Mhm.
other people.
I'd say for entry level devs or like devs who are like super experts and you can just let them jam out complex problems, it's probably closer to like 20%. But when you're like kind of approaching that mid-tier dev, I think it's shifting more towards like 40% or so, because you're doing a lot of code reviews, you're in a lot of meetings, you're having architecture and design discussions. You're if you're helping, I know I mentioned it one like uh, you're kind of I mentioned it once, not on this thing, but just like conceptually, like you're going from kind of like that atomic level of like, okay, here's a unit of work that I deliver up, and you're kind of going into a more compound or molecular kind of level of work where you're starting to have to tie things together, and work on bigger things that require more communication, is more complex, or you might be doing like business development, and then that requires a whole being a good technical writer, so you're not like syncing contract bids and stuff. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into being, I guess, not a good developer. You can be a great developer and only focus on the hard skills of how much you can program, but I think the soft skills have a force multiplier for how good at
that's
that.
a good word for it, force multiplier. I like that. Yeah. You mentioned that, doing your bachelor's, it helps you understand the fundamentals and how to read stuff. So how important do you think is, like, let's say someone doesn't have a college degree and they went more the boot camp or experience route. Like, do you think you got a lot of value out of, doing the 4-year degree in CS and all that?
Yeah. Like, I definitely think I got a lot of value since I didn't do like that, non-college experience of learning like, I guess, programming. I wouldn't necessarily have like a whole lot of insight to them, but like from learning stuff, like I guess the biggest risk is gaps in knowledge of, if you're motivated to learn only about one thing, you might be disincentivized to learn about, the stuff that you find boring or the stuff that sucks. Like I 100% would not code in like micro again, like all the ones and zeros on bits, like under the operating system level. Like that was atrocious. I got a 60 on a project once because I had one bit flipped wrong. So like if I was, if I was 20 and asked to try and learn that, I'd probably look at that and be like, I don't think I'm going to do that. From like a self-teaching perspective, but it also, even if I suck at that particular type of programming, it does help, again, with soft skills of like, okay, how do I organize my code? How do I like troubleshoot? How do I fix issues with stuff that I might not have like all the full tool sets that I'm used to for if I was doing like front end development? So, it's give or take there. I think the biggest thing is like kind of being forced to learn kind of like a set of fundamentals that are kind of have a consensus of like what they are.
Okay.
Yeah.
It kind of makes you well-rounded, and you're right. There's some value to even some of the classes you may have not wanted to take and you kind of want to cherry pick and not do. Same thing like for electrical engineering. There's a lot of classes I took and I don't use some of them at all. And they go off in different directions. And I'm like, oh, that's not my interest, but you're still forced to do it to complete the degree, right? And you have all these fundamentals. And maybe it's also just the practice of like, you have to learn all these things and get through it,
Yeah. And let me try and turn on the light real quick. I realized that the sun has gone down quite a bit. I was like looking like I was living in a cave.
That's where you go to do your coding all day.
Yeah, we only get sun once a year when developers get to go outside. I think there was like learning those fundamentals, like learning stuff that you wouldn't know how to learn. And then you're also just like in an environment like with a bunch of other people who have different interests. I spent a lot of time in the computer science lab, like, working with people and getting that initial team experience. I think one other thing too is just having, your college professors, you kind of start that like kind of aspect of mentorship, which can be really helpful as a developer. Like you're always it's always helpful to have somebody that's kind of like a senior to you that can help provide like insight into, technical problems, help you troubleshoot. That's why peer reviewing and, like merge requests are so effective, is it helps other people look at your code, you're learning stuff from them. And I think that was really helpful in both like in college, because I had a couple of professors I took like pretty much every class I could under them. And then going into my professional like career is kind of like, okay, like the senior dev like knows a lot. I really respect like the work they do. Let me, soak up as much information as I can from them. And then kind of almost being like, I want to be like identifying the kind of developer and consultant you want to be like, and then like taking the steps to gain the skills that they have.
Well,
Yeah.
That's good. You sought that out very early. I wasn't thinking like that in college at all. I wasn't. I think I avoided my professors unless I had to speak to them.
Oh yeah. Well, I would often go and be like, I think I got this question right on the exam, right? And like, no, you didn't. And then they'd explain it to me, and I'd be like, okay, you're right. I'm just dumb. I got that.
Towards the end, as I started getting more confident, I realized they're not like these people to put on a pedestal. Like they want you to learn, they want you to ask questions, they want you to sometimes get clarity on things. And not saying they're dumb sometimes, but sometimes when you're talking with them, you realize what they don't know. And it's more like just like you're right. There's peers, and they're kind of like mentors. They're just further along the path than you, but they're not scary people all the time. I should have talked to my professors more all throughout undergrad.
I did have one scary professor. He was my micro, or I think it was system architecture was when I had to do microcoding. He scared me. He also typed with two fingers, just very, very old school grognardy programmer type guy. And you can learn a lot from them, but you have to figure out how to befriend them first.
Yeah. So let's say somebody was, wanting to learn a language, maybe they're not a dev at all, and they're just interested in learning coding. What's your suggestion on like the one thing that they could go learn that would be really useful?
I think that can be a tough one.
Depends also. That's right. It might be too open-ended. Yeah.
Yeah. I think if I was to recommend a language off the top, I mean, it is always that developer responsive. It depends. Like I have like that kind of object oriented paradigm, kind of that forms how I kind of approach subjects. So, but from like let me learn to code just a little bit, kind of dip my toe. I'd almost say like Python could be a good start. Yeah, it's just like simple scripting language. You're able to get some immediate like value pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be very encouraging when you're first starting. It's not, you're not getting into the weeds with like type safety as much. You're able to kind of just like do stuff and it starts working. So you kind of get that little bit of magic developer, like, oh, I can do this type of stuff. So I think that can be very encouraging. I think that would be my answer.
Yeah, I've heard that one suggested a lot too, because it's useful. People get immediate feedback, and then it's kind of like they would see if they have an aptitude for it, right? It's not the most difficult one, but if they could start learning something and see if it's interesting to them.
Yeah.
Well, as we're ending a little bit, I just wanted to touch a little bit on, you told me a little bit about your hobby with the painting the figurines. I was wondering if you wanted to tell us a little bit about that and why you enjoy it and all.
Yeah. So, for me, it's all about that kind of balance. It's something I enjoy to do. It's relaxing, gets me away from a screen for a bit. So I think, it's important to have that kind of work life.
Like how many hours or how many minutes could you sit there consecutively and work on one thing?
For painting, easily 2 hours, I'd say. Like once you get into the zone, you're just like, all right, this is great. Very single track minded. Just get like some music and a podcast or something going on in the background. I don't get I don't get many 2 hours uninterrupted time, but yeah, it's nice. Something you can just kind of pick up and do for a bit. Good way to wind down at the night.
Yeah.
And then I'm working my little side project with that application, or I guess it's a web app. So if that turns out well, I'll probably make like tens of dollars. So I'll do
tens of
dollars. So I'll be checking out.
Hey, but like we're talking about, sometimes it's best to just have these hobbies that it's more just the pursuit of the thing instead of you're trying to get this thing or you're trying to monetize it. Because if it was all about the money, then you'd start to hate it after a while, probably.
Oh yeah, I have no desire to like turn it into a side hustle. This is all my enjoyment. Like with painting, you can try and become like a commission painter, but then it's like, oh cool, I got $5 for 2 hours of work, or I could just like enjoy myself 2 hours and not have to worry about like a customer.
Is there a way? I don't know how to explain. Can you tell if you're actually getting better at the painting? Is it just like you can do it faster, or you can do it and it's cleaner with like less mistakes? Is it like an iterative thing? Like you can see that you're progressing somehow?
Like it's definitely like iterative. Like every little model that I paint, I can kind of see the improvements on.
Oh, really?
Like I'll have to send you a picture later of like the first model versus like the last model I complete. You know, the first model is just like paint is caked on, like it's dark, you can't see any of the details. Like, you know, and then the next model, it's like, oh look, I have like little hazard stripes that are approximately like a quarter of a millimeter wide, and I'm like, I can't paint this if I've had coffee in the past 2 hours because my caffeine will just like shake the line. So yeah, it's fun, and you know, it's again, you kind of, I'm like, oh, let me learn how to do this. It's like kind of that pursuit of knowledge just for the joy of painting. Shout out to
Yeah.
Bob Ross.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as long as it's iterative somehow to me, and like you said, you could see it that you're actually getting better, and then that would inspire me more than just, like, will you ever be a pro or whatever? Or who cares, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of
Okay,
what
well,
I do myself.
I don't want to take any more of your time. Do you have any last things you want to share with anyone? I don't know if you have, I don't know, a website
Yeah,
or anything.
I don't have anything else to share. Just you know, if you're a developer, um, keep on keep on at it. I guess you know, we're doing our best to keep things working, and yeah, it's been yeah. I don't know. I don't have anything else particularly, but yeah, it's been great talking to you. I appreciate the time and everything.
Oh, you're
We've had a lot of
welcome.
fun.
Thank you. Let me